Hello, my name is David Kalat. I'm the author of a book called The Strange Case of Dr. Mabuse, which deals in part with Fritz Lang's extraordinary cinematic legacy. I will be your tour guide through this definitive presentation of Fritz Lang's 1945 film noir masterpiece, Scarlet Street. Lang said that this was his personal favorite of his American productions, just as M was his favorite among his German films. Not surprisingly, Scarlet Street and M represent those rare points in his storied career when he had essentially unfettered creative autonomy, free to explore his dark visions without dunderheaded interference from front office lackeys. Screenwriter Dudley Nichols, star Joan Bennett, and Fritz Lang himself were co-owners of an independent production company called Diana Productions, whose business operations were overseen by producer Walter Wanger. This short-lived venture gave Lang the greatest creative freedom he ever had in Hollywood, and is largely the reason why this film stands so tall in his American career. This wonderful opening montage demonstrates a typical Langian touch. Many of his films open with little vignettes like this, not directly related to the plot that will come later, but which establish the milieu and tone of the picture. If the bulk of the movie is portraiture, this vignette is like a still life, all about atmosphere. We have this sultry, seductive woman who does not want to be kept waiting. Her lover, Eddie Robinson's boss, will therefore be obliged to hurry through this little ceremony intended to celebrate and reward his 25 years loyal service to the firm. This tableau revolves around murkiness, ambiguity, and things being more shallow and ugly than they are purported to be. And as such, it establishes the overarching theme of the movie. J.J. Hogarth is the authority figure, the patriarch, the father figure for his company, but he is an immoral man cheating on his wife with the girl in the car. This party is ostensibly to reward Chris for his long tenure of hard work, but it's hard to really see it as Chris's big day if the boss rushes through it to get back to his mistress. Chris's reward is a fancy, expensive watch, clearly an item of value, but a perfunctory, thoughtless, and empty gift. In exchange for a quarter-century's faithfulness, it is merely a reminder of his programmatic, controlled life. The watch itself, a 14-carat, 17-jewel timepiece, is one of many prominent clocks that figure in Lang's cinema. Just the previous year, Lang made another suspense thriller called Woman in the Window, also starring Edward G. Robinson, in which Robinson played a man so ruled by habit, Lang superimposed a clock face onto him to visualize the connection. Here, J.J. Hogarth puts it into words, equating the 14-carat 17-jewel watch with his 14-carat 17-jewel cashier. In the opening sequence of Dr. Mabuse der Spieler, Fritz Lang showed Mabuse with a watch, using it to count off and organize the sequence of crimes he'd meticulously planned. In that film, the watch was a symbol of Mabuse's mastery over others. Christopher Cross may own this watch, but it also owns him. By no means does it represent any power of his, but rather his powerlessness. In the opening scene of Woman in the Window, Eddie Robinson's character was introduced giving a masterly lecture for a college that later in the film promoted him. He was comfortable speaking in public and had sure self-confidence. In this film, he barely stammers through an awkward acceptance speech for a ceremony that fairly well makes clear no promotions are in the offing for him. If not after 25 years, then when? Christopher Cross is a weakling, a victim, a loser. He's waited too long to assert himself, and so when he does at last stake out some claim to his own identity and try to change the circumstances of his life, it will go disastrously wrong. In addition to being maltreated by others, he's also oppressed by his own inhibitions. Offered a cigar, he initially demurs. Any change from his deeply ingrained ruts cause him anxiety. He's ruled by superstition as well, crossing his fingers to ward off the bad luck of taking 3 on a match. Woman in the Window, directed by Fritz Lang in 1944, not only overlapped Scarlet Street in terms of both starring Edward Robinson, but indeed all across the board. It also starred Joan Bennett and Dan Duryea, and was also photographed by ace cinematographer Milton Krasner. Woman in the Window featured Robinson as a mild-mannered psychology professor, Richard Wanley, Experiencing a midlife crisis and feeling an urge to rebel against the strictures of his life, he's haunted by the painting of a strikingly beautiful woman that he sees in a gallery window. He actually meets the model, played by Joan Bennett. They share a drink together at a bar before an unfortunate stroke of circumstance finds her threatened by her abusive lover, whom Wanley kills in self-defense. He becomes ensnared by a blackmail plot and ultimately sees a way out only through suicide, only to have his suicide attempt fail. In the last shot, he confronts the painting in the window and reflects on all the things it has come to mean for him, all the things that could have been but aren't. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? Lang admitted the rough outlines of the two films covered the same territory, but insisted that the two movies had radically different meanings. Nevertheless, both films track the gradual moral deterioration of a man whose better nature loses out to his worst instincts. A man who goes from being an upstanding, decent man to a criminal on the run. Different film critics and film scholars rate the two films differently based on their own personal biases, but I'm of the opinion that Scarlet Street is by far the superior picture, and as I said, Lang felt that way too. In the cruel irony of film history, despite Scarlet Street's importance to Lang, its status as a high watermark in the genre of American film noir, and its role as a pivot point in the evolution of independent film production, until now, this extraordinary motion picture has not been available to the average movie buff in any kind of a decent presentation. Previous home video editions were sourced from grubby, low-quality prints, and since the content of the movie revolves around murkiness and moral grays, it didn't help matters for the picture quality to be so murky and dim as well. Thanks to Kino, though, Scarlet Street is finally getting a facelift, using a crisp, clean source element preserved by the Library of Congress. This is the uncensored theatrical version, running 102 minutes. Scarlet Street endured some trims from Lang's original cut, but that deleted footage disappeared forever 60 years ago and was never screened for audiences anyway. During the course of this commentary, I'll point out the missing bits, but rest assured you're seeing Scarlet Street in its most complete official edition. One example of a cut would have been somewhere around this point in the film. In a scene that was apparently cut at the script stage and never filmed, Lang had originally planned to have Robinson's character diverted by a scene inside a shop window of store workers undressing mannequins. He was to have been briefly entranced and then embarrassed by the sexless nudity of the plastic figures, a sort of adolescent response to sexuality that would have shown his arrested development as a man out of step with his actual age. We're in Greenwich Village, or a version of Greenwich Village mocked up on a Los Angeles soundstage. There are some film scholars who've pointed out that Lang almost exclusively worked in controlled studio sets and manufactured environments rather than on real locations, and that this forms a distinct point of contrast in style between his cinema and that of Jean Renoir, whose film La Chienne provided the inspiration for this film. Much of La Chienne was filmed on real locations, for a grubby authenticity that stands in stark contrast to this film's control-freak perfectionism. Although these statements are factually true, it's way too easy to make way too much of this. Yes, Lang worked on controlled sets because in the era in which he worked, almost everyone did. It doesn't really mean anything. There's an odd irony that when you have almost no money with which to make a movie, shooting on location is an obvious solution to paying money for sets and set designers and prop makers and what have you. But on the other side of the equation, if you're spending lots of money on a film, it's cheaper to work on a soundstage because you don't want your expensive actors waiting around for the weather to change or the street noise to die down. So, classical Hollywood style, which prioritized glamour and strong production values, depended on control of every aspect of production. As the years wore on, more and more filmmakers started to experiment with the effect of shooting on location. For example, Panic in the Streets in 1950 or Call Northside 777 in 1948 stand out from the pack because of their ostentatious lack of control, their unaffected realism. But those movies had a weird feel to them that audiences had to get used to. Meanwhile, it would take technological advances and improved film stocks and lighter camera equipment before the practice could become widespread. At the time of Scarlet Street, the kind of manufactured realism you see here was the norm. Clothes make the man, as the saying goes, and the clothes in Scarlet Street have an especially piquant symbolic role. In this scene already we're seeing how clothes dictate what conclusions we draw about people. Kitty has seen Chris all decked out in a tuxedo and wrongly concluded that he is rich. I mean, who else wears such fancy clothes? And as for Kitty herself, that clear plastic raincoat is almost like a cellophane wrapper. Writing for the superb study of film noir by Elaine Silver and Elizabeth Ward, film historian Julie Kurgo noted that Kitty is all wrapped up like a disposable good, a lollipop in its plastic wrapper, a consumer product. Lang had to rely on little cues like this because he was forbidden by the production code to call Kitty a prostitute outright. He had to find subtle ways of signaling that fact to the attentive viewer without outraging the censors. In addition to its mirror relationship to Woman in the Window, this movie is also tightly connected to Jean Renoir's French-language La Chienne, of which Scarlet Street is an extremely faithful remake. Renoir's La Chienne came out in Europe in 1931. Fritz Lang saw the film with editor Paul Falkenberg not long after working on M, and Falkenberg later recalled Lang's reaction. Quote, "The scene is in a garret of a Parisian Montmartre house. The girl is in her room directly under the roof. The camera looks in from the roof outside, and you see just the tiles of the roof and the window, and it's open." And Lang whispered, "Oh yes, I see a little angel took the camera, flew up to the roof, and looked into the room." He was fully aware that this was a totally arbitrary and artificial way of cinematic omniscience. End quote. Falkenberg found that this stuck in his mind, and forever after he was skeptical of odd angles or viewpoints that seemed to be outside of reality. Meanwhile, the experience stuck in Lang's mind for perhaps other reasons. He remembered the film fondly despite Renoir's extravagant cinematic flourishes, and when Diana Productions was formed, Lang immediately thought of remaking La Chienne. Lang was fresh off a contract at Paramount, and he learned while there that Paramount had bought the remake rights on behalf of Ernst Lubitsch, who'd struggled for years without successfully updating the storyline to American tastes. Thus, the property could be had fairly cheaply, since Paramount would be inclined to want to cut their losses. Lang also figured that the key to Americanizing the film was in the setting. The Renoir film was set in the bohemian art colonies of Montmartre, which actually has an American equivalent, more or less, in New York's Greenwich Village. Lang and screenwriter Dudley Nichols wanted to screen the movie again in preparation of their version, but were unable to find a print. Renoir's film had suffered a fate common to European pictures during the war years and all but vanished. It resurfaced years later and is available on video now, from Kino no less, but in 1945 all Lang had were his memories. Surprising, then, how often the staging of the two versions do coincide. Although the content of the two films pace through the same story developments point by point, there are important divergences between them. Most striking is the difference in tone. Renoir's film is a charming social satire much more light-hearted than the harsh bitterness and cynicism of Lang's film noir. La Chienne opens with a puppet theater proscenium, a sort of Punch and Judy show, and the puppets announce the coming film first as a serious social drama proving no vice goes unpunished. Another puppet interrupts and says, no, this will be a comedy with a moral. And a third puppet shouts the first ones down and explains that what follows will be neither comedy nor drama, with no moral, and will prove nothing at all. Lang pushed it back in the direction of a serious social drama, and he openly said in interviews that the moral of Scarlet Street is crime does not pay. And yet, he does this with precious few alterations to La Chienne's script. One change, presumably mandated by the Puritanical Hayes Office, was a suppression of the original's explicit sexuality. In Renoir's telling, the prostitute very clearly has a sexual relationship with the old man, and she complains quite nastily about it to her girlfriend. But the most significant alteration is the way the characters relate to one another. At its core, the triangle includes a prostitute and her pimp who set out to exploit a man going through a midlife crisis. In Renoir's version, the pimp mistakenly concludes the man is a great and famous artist, and this becomes the primary hook by which to finagle money from him. Otherwise, though, the three characters basically have no illusions about each other. The old man, played by Michel Simon, has seen the girl and her pimp together, and he knows they're connected, and he understands that he's buying her favors. And for her part, she knows that he's not really a rich artist. By contrast, in Scarlet Street, the three main characters are all hiding behind false fronts. Eddie Robinson is getting a kick out of being mistaken for the man that he wishes he was, and eagerly nurtures Joan Bennett's illusions about him. Meanwhile, not only does she pretend to be in love with him, but she also poses as an actress. Danderrier flits between roles as the circumstances merit, and perhaps because he's accustomed to living behind a mask, he's the one to penetrate Chris's facade. He's suspicious of Akan and suspects his paintings are worthless. The only thing that switches him back is the intercession of art critics, who in turn swallow his lies about Kitty being the artist. Tom Gunning has written about what he calls Lang's destiny machines, story structures that act the role of fate. Prime the engine by feeding it the right circumstances, and it'll proceed to destroy the characters completely. And here the destiny machine is created by this three-way lie. Chris only succumbs to temptation because Kitty offers him what he craves most, the sense of being loved and appreciated for who he is. But she only pretends to offer that because she thinks he's rich. If at some point early on one of these characters came clean with the others and told the truth, the situation would defuse and everybody would come out of it alive and intact. One of the issues in Americanizing the Renoir film was finding an appropriate English language title. You couldn't call the film The Bitch, which is the translation of La Chienne. You couldn't even use that title today. Lang started work on the project using a working title of Pomander Walk. Later, he changed that to Poor Sap, but was still unsatisfied. The screenwriter originally attached to the project before Dudley Nichols came on board, Ludwig Bemelmans, wanted to call it Playboy. Lang had a roundtable brainstorming session with Bemelmans, Walter Wanger, Joan Bennett, and the various publicity mavens and their staff, and after a few misfires and rejects, Lang took to reading off street names from a map of Greenwich Village. After hitting Carmine Street, Lang said, "Ah, Scarlet Street," and they had their title. It was a masterstroke, drawing on all the various connotations of the word scarlet as something sinful. So a Scarlet Street is a red light district, a street of whores. Lang has said he didn't know what the title meant at the time and only later realized he was drawing on memories of the Bible, in which the whore of Babylon is described as a scarlet woman. There's been discussion about Chris's painting as an example of expressionist art, and I'll talk later about another way of evaluating his artistic style, but here's a good point to indulge the expressionist viewpoint. He can look at that sad, wilted flower in a grimy drinking glass and sit exiled in his bathroom sitting on the potty because his wife won't let him paint anywhere else, but express what he feels that flower means to him as a gift from Kitty in the form of an extravagant floral display. He later tells Kitty that he paints what he feels. He tries to draw a line around his emotions and capture that on the canvas. It's the only way he can survive his degraded, cramped existence, an essentially thankless job and a loveless marriage that he can endure because of his inner emotional life, which he gets to live out through his paintings. His friend Charlie shrugs it off as merely one way to kill the time, but it means so much more to Chris. Charlie asks about Homer's portrait. "Did you paint this?" And Chris is disgusted. "That's mud," he says. "It's a photograph with a real medal stuck on it, an attempt at realism, unlike the expressionism that he enjoys." Interestingly, it turns out to be just as inaccurate a representation as his own paintings, just as much a fantasy image of what something is supposed to be as opposed to what it actually is. This huge, heroic image, this titan of a man in his hero's badge, is a fantasy vision of a sleazy con man who faked his own death. In his survey of Lang's films, critic Paul Jensen found Scarlet Street inferior to Woman in the Window because of the unpleasant characters that populated, with Edward G. Robinson's character coming in for an especially scathing review. Jensen writes, quote, "Criss Cross is so often being used by others, he's such a pawn and a tool, that viewers not only fail to empathize, but they also cease to care anything at all about what happens to him. Degradation is piled on degradation, and there is never a pause for anything or anyone positive. Even in what we see of Cross's prior life, the man is a weakling who married a landlady in order to save money on rent, a non-entity who's wasted 20 years at the same store in exchange for a gold watch. At home, he's henpecked, and he wears an apron while washing the dishes. Because he never had any stature or virtues or innocence that he could lose, Chris deserves and receives no pity from viewers." That's harsh. Jensen's entitled to his opinion for sure, but I strongly disagree on the question of Cross's sympathetic nature to viewers. I find Robinson's portrayal to be extraordinarily warm and humane, and far more sympathetic than the character essayed by Michel Simon in Renoir's version. This performance stands for me as a superb example of what made Robinson such a great actor. There are many movie stars whose career trades on a specific, iconic aspect of their persona, and in movie after movie they play minor variations of the same basic character. Then there are those who are the Meryl Streeps and Peter Sellerses of the industry who disappear so completely into their roles you're never sure of their real-world identities. Robinson belongs to an extremely rarefied world between these extremes. He has highly distinctive physical features and an unmistakable voice, yet he can use those traits to play a wide variety of roles. Just consider the range that he showed during a 4-year stretch from his career. The quiet authority and wisdom of his roles in Double Indemnity in 1944 and The Stranger in 1946, versus his wimpy nebbishness here in 1945, versus the cruel brutality and aggression he showed in Key Largo, 1948. The American Film Institute named him one of their 50 greatest screen legends for good cause. He lived the first decade of his life in a Yiddish community in Russia under the name Emanuel Goldenberg, before emigrating to New York and showing precocious acting gifts. His first on-screen role came in 1916 at age 23, and he remained prolific until his death in 1973 after appearing in Soylent Green. He received $100,000 for his work in this film, a sum in excess of what Lang himself was paid, and it was a rare time in Lang's career when he treated a star well. Thanks to Matthew Bernstein, I have a copy of some notes made at one of Lang's meetings at Diana Productions from October 12, 1945, after principal photography was completed. There's a somewhat rambling stream of consciousness tone to these notes, presumably transcribed as Lang talked, but it's a fascinating insight into what he was thinking during the making of the film, and I'd like to read you some excerpts. He's ruminating on the character of Criss Cross and what drives him, and how both realistic and universal his characteristics are. Quote, "Everybody wants to sleep with a girl. Everybody wants to eat. Everybody wants to have a lot of money. We see our own weaknesses when we see somebody shown realistically. Therefore, we follow the story more closely. They're not just dolls, puppets on strings. They become living beings. The important thing, that the girl at the beginning doesn't want to take the old man for a ride. But under the influence of the boy, she does. And out of this comes the old Greek tragedy that everybody is responsible for his fate. The old man has never the guts to say to his father, 'I want to be a painter.' He becomes a cashier, couldn't fulfill himself. Moves into this house, didn't have a lot of money. She was sweet, he slept with her, married her. He's responsible for his fate. He goes down to Greenwich Village, goes with this girl, and in spite of the fact that he should know by now that he shouldn't, falls in love with such a girl. So he got everything that he deserved. Starts to steal from his employer for this girl. He starts his fate, and he's finished. Boy isn't good from the beginning, thinks he's smart, and by a dame the old man is put on the spot. She knows better. She doesn't want to sleep with the guy. Finally, she does it because it's the way of least resistance. So she cannot complain. She has created something, made the old man think she's in love with him. So all three people are guilty of something, like a Greek tragedy. One of the reasons I wanted to read that to you was as a counterpoint to Paul Jensen's remarks regarding Cross being undeserving of sympathy, because it's clear by hearing Lang describe his own scenario that he sees Cross as a sympathetic, if flawed figure whose faults we will recognize as reflections of our own. Everybody wants to sleep with a girl, says Lang, and proceeds on the assumption we will respond to Cross, warts and all, as an everyman sort of character. Fritz Lang needed good screenwriters. His visual aesthetic needed context, and his spotty English needed a crutch. Even in his German years, he relied heavily on the creative input of Thea von Harbu, who functioned as a true co-creator of his greatest and most epic films. In the U.S., the closest analog he ever had to Thea von Harbu was a man named Dudley Nichols. They had first been paired on the 1941 spy thriller Manhunt, which also saw Lang's first collaboration with Joan Bennett. Nichols got in touch with Lang after seeing Woman in the Window and liking it. He wrote to Lang, "Like yourself, I'm not interested in just making pictures. The thing that fascinates is the exceptional story. For me, the attraction is the right story and the right director, and it's been too long since Manhunt." Lang agreed. They needed to work together again, but Wanger had already hired Ludwig Bemelmans to write Scarlet Street. Bemelmans was a cartoonist from The New Yorker, best known today as the creator of the popular Madeline children's book series, and Wanger figured that as an Austrian émigré, like Lang, they were destined to see eye to eye. They did not, and after wasting time and money trying to make that star-crossed partnership work, Lang was given the go-ahead to bring in his old friend Nichols. Once he saw the setup at Diana and realized this was Fritz Lang's company, Nichols decided he wanted in too and deferred half his salary to buy a 10% stake. He stayed on as a company director until Lang's ongoing feud with Walter Wanger reached a fever pitch and he saw the inevitable train wreck ahead. Nichols cashed out and they did not work together again. The actress playing Millie Ray, Kitty's erstwhile roommate, is Margaret Lindsay. She had been a contract player for Warner Brothers, where she appeared in over 30 films between 1933 and 1940, flitting between big-budget prestige pictures and low-budget filler, getting starring roles and supporting roles. In 1940, she began co-starring in Columbia's Ellery Queen mystery series, playing the role of Nikki Porter in 7 consecutive features. By the time of Scarlet Street, though, her career was on a downward swing. She made this film for Fritz Lang sandwiched between 2 Edgar Ulmer movies over at Poverty Row House, PRC. During the silent era, motion pictures were screened to live musical accompaniment, and on occasion Lang was even involved in selecting an official score to be performed to a film such as Metropolis. But when he made the leap to sound films, Lang backed off from the use of music significantly. He became increasingly interested in realism and felt that musical soundtracks in movies had an often fake feeling to them, a distancing effect on the audience that signaled something was manufactured and fictional. At the same time, more than most filmmakers of the period, he experimented with sound effects and sound design as a way of enhancing and serving the drama without violating his notions of realism. In the case of Scarlet Street, you can see that aesthetic at work. On this film, Lang was working with Hollywood's most in-demand composer, the prodigious Hans Salter. Over the course of a 30-year career at Universal, Salter composed scores for hundreds of movies, including many of Universal's beloved Gothic horror classics. Lang's remit to Salter was not to write big themes for the movie, but instead to create a soundscape of music that came from sources within the various scenes, radios, phonographs, and so on. For example, the tune Melancholy Baby, which attends this scene, is something Kitty is playing on her record player. Professional film scholars have a fancy $10 word for this technique and call it diegetic music. Those of you keen to find the parallels between Lang and Hitchcock will note that this is essentially the same instruction Hitchcock gave to Bernard Herrmann on Rear Window in 1954, 9 years later. Salter had been recommended by the folks at Universal, who didn't even realize how deep the connections ran between these two artists. Not only were both men ex-Viennese immigrants, not only were they both once employed at Germany's legendary UFA studio, but get this, Salter, in his youth, had conducted Lang's score for Woman in the Moon for performances of that, Lang's last ever silent film, at Berlin's prestigious UFA Palast am Zoo Theater. However, despite Lang's general preference for diegetic music, Salter did place some more traditional movie music in the film at key points. Lang's only resistance to this came during the finale, when Lang felt that Salter's original composition was too upbeat for the ending, and that the musical theme needed to better represent the dramatic theme of a man driven to ruin by self-destructive impulses and crushing guilt. Salter tried again, and both men agreed the second version was vastly superior. In the final analysis, Salter looked back on his score for Scarlet Street as one of his personal favorites. Back in his 1926 silent film Spies, Lang had played with the theme of a woman who fakes love in order to advance a secret agenda. In that film, actress Gerda Maurus played Sonia, a spy hired by master criminal Hagi to seduce and betray the proto-James Bond spy hero. She actually falls in love with him, though, and switches sides. However, another of Hagi's agents does carry out a similar whorish mission. She's sent to seduce and betray a Japanese diplomat, and she uses all her sexual wiles to destroy him. It's probably no coincidence that character was also named Kitty. The name evidently had recurring connotations for Lang. In The Thousand Eyes of Dr. Mabuse, Lang created an updated version of the Sonia character from Spies, casting Dawn Adams as an agent of master criminal Dr. Mabuse, hired to seduce and betray a wealthy American business tycoon. She falls for him for real and switches sides. Alfred Hitchcock was similarly fascinated by the idea of a woman who would feign love and engage in sex in order to exploit a man for some ulterior motive. In films like Notorious, North by Northwest, and Topaz, Hitchcock created sexy female agents who defended American national security using their sex appeal. Joan Bennett in Scarlet Street is in a different league from those characters. She has neither an 11th hour redemptive change of heart nor a noble purpose. Her exploitation of Chris Cross is venal and cruel, motivated by no greater good than the enrichment of her sadistic pimp. Lottie Eisner's chapter on Scarlet Street discusses the symbolic value of character names in this film. She points out how the nickname Lazy Legs suggests Kitty is such a lazy prostitute she's ineffective at it, and then goes on to say that Crisscross's name aptly describes a man crisscrossing his way through life. Well, for all I'm indebted to Miss Eisner for, I think I disagree. Crisscrossing one's way through life, an awkward phrase to start with, if anything, suggests to me an aimless person. A person leading a sort of haphazard existence. And that, to me, describes Johnny Prince, not Edward G. Robinson's character. Far from aimless wandering, he's controlled. He's too controlled. He leads an inhibited, repressed, circumscribed life in which his only deviation from what others expect of him is his quiet hobby of painting. His inhibitions are so strong that at first he can't go through with his plan of stealing from his employer. And while I don't have any sources at hand to cite specifically, I don't doubt that somewhere out there some enterprising film scholar has taken to decoding Robinson's role as a Christ figure, Christ on the cross. But I'm just as dismissive of that reading as I am of Eisner's. Aside from the ostentatious nature of the name crisscross, which fairly begs to be seen as a symbol of some kind, there's nothing else here that properly supports a Christ symbol interpretation. I'd say that the crisscross name has a more obvious and simple reading. There are two primary meanings for the phrase crisscross: a surprising connection between two things and a betrayal. In both cases, crisscross refers to connections going wrong. The crisscross character is the connection between two different bizarre love triangles, and he betrays and destroys both. The first is the triangle between Kitty, Johnny, and himself. Kitty and Johnny are an actual couple, connected sexually, romantically, and economically, but this is concealed. Chris believes himself to be in a romantic relationship with Kitty, unaware of the hidden link between Kitty and Johnny. The other triangle is Chris, Adele, and her supposedly dead first husband, Homer. Adele and Homer were supposed to have been the ideal married couple, the pinnacle of what a relationship between a woman and a man was supposed to have been. More than that, a relationship between a woman and a true man, as opposed to Chris's degraded effeminacy. As with the Kitty-Johnny axis, the woman of this triangle professes true love for a man that we in the audience can clearly see doesn't deserve it. And again, on top of this intense relationship, Chris has projected a phantom version starring himself. And if you think of these two triangles as being mapped out on a Venn diagram, Chris is the intersection. And he destroys both in the same basic way by exposing the hidden relationship and forcing the woman to choose. Confronted with the reality of her first husband's continued existence, Adele and Chris's marriage dissolves, and we can be reasonably certain she and Patchai Homer don't live happily ever after either. And when Chris discovers the truth about Kitty and Johnny, that'll be the end of them too. Speaking of the interpretation of names, none of the commentators on this film have mentioned that in writing their script, Lang and Dudley Nichols maintained one character name from the original. Everybody got a new identity save for Adele, whose name stayed from the French version to this one. The name Adele is of Germanic origin, so Lang would probably have known that it means noble. And you can savor the irony of that one yourself. For those of you unfamiliar with Fritz Lang, a quick primer. He had risen to international stardom as the visionary director of lavish, epic spectacles during Germany's golden age of silent film. With the advent of talkies and the rise of Adolf Hitler, Lang departed Germany to start over in Hollywood. It was a wrenching transition. On top of the challenges of learning English and getting the feel of American culture, Lang found the American film industry to be a radically different animal than the one that he'd tamed in Germany. During the German years, he had become accustomed to operating as a petty dictator on his set, with largely unchecked authority over the entire production. He was mostly insulated from the negative consequences of his perfectionist tendencies to go over budget and off schedule, and he was rewarded for making enormously long, insanely expensive films aimed at a cultured audience of mature, educated adults. He was in his own right a superstar. Lang left that behind to come to America. American movies were expected to be shorter, more cost-conscious, aimed at a younger, less sophisticated audience. The classic Hollywood studio was a rigid, top-down corporation in which directors, actors, and all the sundry other craftspeople were assets under the direction of bureaucrats whose job function was to moderate the flow of money. In Hollywood, it was all but impossible to secure the kind of creative freedom Lang had taken for granted in Germany. He rankled against anything he perceived as usurping his authority, and so his story in Hollywood is one long string of battles, antagonism, and mutual disrespect. From his very first picture, Fury, onwards, Lang picked fights with all the wrong people, alienating potential allies and convincing everyone that this German big shot was an arrogant asshole. Lang eked it out over the next decade, making good films and bad in an atmosphere of hostility. His reputation diminished as time went on, and he shuffled from one studio to another, burning bridges behind him and slamming doors shut in front. From 1934 to 1944, Lang made just 8 movies at 5 different studios. In the same period, Alfred Hitchcock directed exactly twice as many movies, his star rising with each one. Anybody could look at this record and see that Lang was a naturally combative, high-maintenance person. But if you looked closer, you would also see that his best work was usually accompanied by the greatest conflict, while his least interesting works were made when Lang played nice. In other words, he genuinely was a visionary artist with great ideas who was stuck fighting for them. When he fought hardest, he often won, and his films benefited. When he acquiesced and gave up, the work suffered. What he needed was to be given the space within which to experiment with his ideas without having to fight for them, a mechanism by which to be insulated from his ever-worsening reputation. He needed to be his own boss in an environment outside the studios, away from studio politics and their entrenched routines of working. This implied independent production, but it's important to discuss the distinction between studio and independent production in the 1940s, because it meant something very different then than what it signals today. The strength of the studio system was an organized structure with a dedicated talent pool, but that was also its greatest weakness. Movies that fell outside the well-established formulas were extremely difficult to do within the system. For example, the market for low-budget B pictures to carry the lower half of double bills were something studios had difficulty making, and so one category of independent production in the 1940s were the slumlords of Poverty Row, who cornered the market on cheapo B-movie production. Big studios with their high overheads just couldn't work in such bottom-feeding budgets. And by the same token, they couldn't easily take on budgets much higher than their established zone. Things that fell in the middle, studios could do better than anyone, but there were niches to be found. Another problem with the studio system was that especially talented people didn't much like sacrificing control over their creative lives and career destinies. So when their contracts expired, there were some talents who opted not to re-up their contracts, nor to negotiate similar terms at some other studio, but to go freelance. And since the studios were obligated to work with their contract players, it meant that there was a free-floating talent pool of often exceptional quality that existed outside the studio system. So in addition to the low-end indie world of Poverty Row, there was a higher tier of independent production in the 1940s, whereby freelance producers put together big prestige productions using expensive movie stars and creative directors. They would arrange with one of the major studios for partial financing. The studio would distribute the finished product, but the independent company would retain ownership of the film. It was a win-win situation. The studios could get a higher caliber of product than they could comfortably make in-house, and they could get it without having to pay full price. Meanwhile, the independents could work with greater freedom and make vastly more money in the bargain. Nunnally Johnson was one such independent producer, and in 1943 he formed his own company called International Pictures. In 1944, Fritz Lang was kicked out of Paramount and was once again between gigs. Johnson hired Lang, and thus was Woman in the Window made. This would lead directly to the conditions by which Lang would get his independence, thanks to star Joan Bennett. Now, Joan Bennett was from an acting family, an acting dynasty, in fact, that stretched all the way back to the 18th century. She made her screen debut in 1916, a full year before even Fritz Lang started working. She continued to be a very popular movie star throughout the 1920s and 1930s, and in 1941 made the first of several films for Fritz Lang, Manhunt. They began a second feature together, Confirm or Deny, before Lang's habitual troubles getting along with producers found him off the project, which was then completed by Archie Mayo. Not long after that, Bennett took a hiatus from the movies to start a family, and after a few years as a mommy, was ready to return to the screen, but was anxious that she'd perhaps damaged her career by taking time off to have kids. And in addition to lost time, she was fearful that with age she was losing her looks and slipping from her popularity. At that critical moment of vulnerability, Lang cast her in Woman in the Window in a role designed to showcase her sexual allure, to make her glamorous and seductive. She felt that Lang was able to draw from her better performances than she could give lesser directors, and she was grateful for what she saw as a comeback. The film was very successful, critically and commercially, and she came out of the experience looking for ways to work with Lang again. And thus was an idea born. I'm indebted to Mr. Matthew Bernstein, who wrote an astoundingly well-researched article for a magazine called The Velvet Light Trap in 1986, called Fritz Lang Incorporated. I don't have time here to cover everything he discovered about the inception and ultimate demise of Fritz Lang's production company, but if you're interested in the business side of film history, I strongly exhort you to seek out issue number 33 of The Velvet Light Trap for Bernstein's full text. To give you the edited highlights, Bennett went to her husband with the idea of founding a production company between her and Fritz Lang so that they could continue to collaborate. It would be good for her career to keep up the partnership with Lang, and she knew him well enough by now to see that he needed the freedom from studio life. Joan's husband was a well-respected producer at Universal Studios, and his extensive industry connections and his handsome profits from Universal's films were what she would need to make this idea a reality. The only problem was, her husband was Walter Wanger, and he'd produced Lang's second American film, You Only Live Once, back in 1937. He knew Lang too, but his first-hand experience with the guy was not the positive one his wife had. Wanger deemed Lang impossible. In what universe did it make sense to take a man who'd spent a freaking day shooting a scene of Henry Fonda eating ice cream and give him control over a whole production company? It would be the proverbial fox in the henhouse. However, Wanger and Bennett agreed that Lang's ego had been bruised from his unhappy strife in Hollywood, and he longed to feel like a big man the way he did back in Germany. Perhaps it wasn't so much that he needed to be his own boss as it was he needed to think he was his own boss. Also, Wanger's own attorneys pointed out to him that the A-list prestige that could be had from big-budgeted movies by Fritz Lang starring Joan Bennett was far out of the league from the kind of middling stuff Wanger was making in-house at Universal. Even minor profit participation in such a venture would be worth half ownership of anything at Universal, not to mention the intangible benefits of keeping Mrs. Wanger happy. The company they formed was christened Diana Productions. There were 1,000 shares at $75 apiece. Lang bought 503 2/3 shares for $38,000. Joan Bennett, using Walter's money, bought 316 2/3 shares for $23,750. The remainder were sold to various friends, and as I mentioned earlier, Dudley Nichols eventually bought a 10% share of his own. Thus was raised $75,000, which had been budgeted for the pre-production development cost of Diana's first project. Although it was Wanger's money used to capitalize the firm and his contacts in the industry that established it, and his ongoing relationship with Universal that provided Diana's distribution, Walter Wanger himself did not take any shares. He was a salaried vice president with 12.5% profit sharing on the final product. Lang was majority shareholder and the official president of Diana, with the power to replace company directors. Wanger later explained his reasoning. He said that making Lang the majority shareholder was, quote, the only way to build the man up so that he wouldn't have this inferiority complex and be so difficult. The idea was that if people once showed confidence in him, he would be very easy to control. In other words, even though the official corporate structure placed Lang at the top of the hierarchy, Wanger fully expected to be the actual boss, ruling from his vice presidential post. The actual divisions of responsibilities between Langer and Wang were designed to carve up the traditional job of producer into two distinct spheres. Lang claimed as his territory the creative realm, everything to do with the actual making of the movie, while Wanger was tasked with the business operations of the company, which for the most part meant its dealings with Universal. Wanger had traded on his happy tenure at Universal to help set Diana up in business, and Universal paid for the majority of Scarlet Street's budget and would distribute it. When Wanger negotiated the terms of this deal with Universal, then, he agreed to a clause whereby Universal retained the right of final cut. Specifically, the contract read, Universal may recut and re-edit said photoplay in such manner as we may deem necessary or desirable to meet legal, Hays Office, or censorship requirements, or export requirements, or for the purpose of avoiding possible litigation, or to enhance its commercial value. Now, notice that last bit, to enhance its commercial value. That's pretty nebulous. And it gives Universal discretion to disagree with Lang on creative matters and enforce their view on the finished film. It was the sort of clause that Lang would never have agreed to himself, and the sort of thing that Wanger ought to have rejected. But in Wanger's view, both Diana and Universal shared a common goal of profiting from the exhibition of the finished film, and so if Universal's experienced staff had suggestions that would get them to that goal, so much the better for everyone. It was also notably identical language to that in his own personal contract with Universal, and so he was comfortable with its application from his own past experience. There were other clauses in the agreement which further restricted the independence of this independent production company, for example, giving Universal the power to take over the production if Lang went over budget. But in the end, these were not put into use. Lang did go over budget and off schedule, spending $200,000 more than the $1.14 million he'd been allotted, and falling almost a week behind schedule. But there were no consequences. Walter Wanger merely sent Lang a memo saying cheekily, "Here's the key how to make $250,000. Put this under your pillow." It was only after the movie that problems arose. The contract gave Universal the right to alter the movie to avoid censorship problems, and although later in the track I'll talk more about the extensive censorship fights that did actually happen with this movie, Universal didn't anticipate the problems and took no advanced steps to cut the film on censorship grounds. But they did make cuts. I'll talk more later about specifically what was cut, but what matters right now is that their publicity department felt the film was too long and needed to be trimmed up for commercial appeal. The Universal sales staff loved the movie and gushed, "It'll make buckets of money." But they recommended snipping out roughly 3 minutes of material. Wanger didn't fight. He agreed to the cuts and agreed with their reasoning. Of that revised version, which is the one we're watching on this DVD, Universal's VP and General Manager Cliff Work said, quote, "Without any hesitation or equivocation, I am happy to state that in my opinion, this is the best picture that has ever been made at Universal and will measure up to the standard of any picture made in the industry in the past years. It unquestionably will outgross any picture that we've released in the past 10 years and is the picture we've been anxiously hoping to have on our program." Now, those are strong words of praise. But Lang was incensed beyond reconciliation that Wanger had made these cuts. Wanger took for granted he and Universal were on the same side, and that with minor revisions they had made a film of extraordinary commercial value that would make them all money and secure future professional advantages for Lang and Bennett. Nothing but good was going to come of this. For his part, though, Lang took for granted that Universal was the enemy, and he saw it as Wanger's job, his specific, delineated function at Diana, to fight with Universal on Lang's behalf. The whole point of having your own company, thought Lang, was not having to listen to the cockamamie ideas of those studio boobs. As far as Lang was concerned, Wanger had shown profound dereliction of duty and outright disloyalty and had butchered Lang's film. For all his railing about Wanger being disloyal, Lang went and did a disloyal thing of his own. After finishing Scarlet Street, Lang realized his prospects were in doubt. Maybe the film would be a hit, maybe he'd make a lot of money on it, maybe he'd continue to make hits at Diana. But all of that was in the future and uncertain. So how to pay the bills now? Rather than take the risk and wait, Lang accepted an offer to go to work for Milton Sperling, a producer with the independent house United States Pictures, feeding films into Warner Brothers much as Diana fed Universal. And there he made Cloak and Dagger, a spy thriller with Gary Cooper, and in doing so he made Wanger angry. One of the distinctive selling points of Diana was to have been Fritz Lang himself. This was the place to go for Fritz Lang movies. It was Lang's prestige as a visionary artist that gave the company its boost. Meeting after meeting had been held between Lang and publicist Margaret Ettinger about how best to promote the Fritz Lang brand. By selling his services to the competition, Lang was diluting Diana's value. Eventually, the tensions between Lang and Wanger were going to hit their breaking point. Dudley Nichols saw the end coming and cashed out his share of Diana, which deprived Lang of the services of his greatest English-language screenwriter. For the follow-up to Scarlet Street, Lang was going to need someone of Nichols's caliber, but Lang foolishly allowed himself to think with his dick and use as screenwriter his latest girlfriend, Sylvia Richards, who styled herself a writer. When Peter Bogdanovich asked Lang about the genesis of the film's Secret Beyond the Door, Lang shrugged it off, saying it was just some old script Wanger had lying around. Actually, what happened was this. Lang had already selected Winchester 73 as the project he wanted to pursue next, and Wanger had optioned story rights to Secret Beyond the Door, a psychological thriller published in Red Book that Wanger thought would be good for Lang. While Lang was busy on Cloak and Dagger, Wanger got Universal's approval to proceed with developing both ideas. But the writer they hired to handle Winchester 73 bungled the job and wrote a massive and unusable treatment that had to be abandoned, so the other project fell into place as a backup. Lang apparently insisted on having Sylvia Richards write it, and things slid slowly downhill from there. Secret Beyond the Door went enormously over budget and off schedule, of course, but not just because of Lang's infamous perfectionism. It was as if the thing had been cursed by the gods. And by now, Lang had so tested Wanger's patience that whatever goodwill and deference he'd gotten on Scarlet Street was nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, Universal was losing patience with Diana too. The industry conditions that had made Diana such a good deal in 1945 had changed. For one thing, the British had imposed a 75% tariff on Hollywood imports, and the U.S. industry responded by boycotting the English market altogether. With the blow to foreign revenues, now was simply not the time to be spending money like water, as Lang was, or blithely disregarding carefully thought-out budgets. Secondly, and more specifically, Universal had bought Nunnally Johnson's International Pictures and its stable of high-quality talent, and thus it was no longer the case that they needed an outside contractor like Diana in order to make good movies. When push came to shove, Universal didn't have any reason to show tolerance to Diana. Secret Beyond the Door was a bomb. Walter Wanger could see that Lang was only going to drive the company further into the ground, and he let Lang buy Joan Bennett out for a fraction of what she'd paid. But since the value of the company was only going to decline, it was worth it to them. Lang was left with unchallenged ownership and control of his own production company, but he'd destroyed all ties to Universal in the process and alienated the only other people and institutions in Hollywood who could have substituted. So Diana was essentially useless to him. As a company, it never made another movie. Winchester 73 was absorbed into Universal and ultimately made by Anthony Mann a few years later. And Lang was working with another indie outfit, Fidelity Pictures, making House by the River. Only Fritz Lang could have snagged defeat from the jaws of victory so spectacularly. Scarlet Street was everything it should have been, a true pinnacle of Lang's American career in terms of artistry, commercial success, and a cordial working environment offering Lang the finest collaborators and the most agreeable creative freedoms. His self-destructive impulses took that accomplishment and squandered everything it could have meant for him, which is sad, but perhaps that is why he was so good at making movies about self-destruction and doom. Maybe if he'd lived a happy, stable life free of conflict, we, his fans, would have been denied such cinematic gems.
Are they any good? Well, they've got something. A certain peculiar something.
Chris's paintings have trouble with perspective, because of course he himself does. His paintings don't conform to reality because they aren't actually modeled on it at all, but are projections of his desires and fantasies. He can look at a sad, wilting flower and paint a lush bouquet because he sees what isn't there, but ought to be. His portrait of Adele is almost unrecognizable to those of us who've actually seen the evil shrew. Even his painting of Kitty, which they will title Self-Portrait, is not so much a portrait of the woman he knows as a depiction of the woman that he wishes she was. In this way, it is apt to call it a self-portrait, since it depicts his self more than it does hers. And the idea of a man's picture of his girlfriend being called a self-portrait also gets at the kinkier side of this relationship. Many contemporary reviewers of the film singled out the scene of Robinson washing dishes wearing an apron as proof of his emasculated nature. Meanwhile, the art critics in the story are briefly puzzled by Kitty because they assumed the paintings displayed a man's hand. While the audience has to accept Chris as a feminine man, the art critics have to accept Kitty as a masculine woman. Gender lines are being crossed. And since Kitty is not an artist, her persona as one, masculine or otherwise, depends on Chris supplying her with paintings. He's happy to do so. Weird is still happy to let her sign her name to them, because he likens it to marriage, one in which he's assumed his wife's name. You can take all the sadistic slaps that Dan Duryea gives Joan Bennett and keep them. For my money, the kinkiest thing about this movie is how a man remakes himself as a woman. Throughout the film, gender roles are getting mixed up, and with that fact comes the way in which, together, Kitty and Chris are projecting a single identity. The Catherine March that the world knows, the one that is becoming rich and famous, is a composite identity made up of a man and a woman. I mentioned before that clothes in Scarlet Street have a symbolic function. This is Johnny Prince's favorite attire, a pinstripe zoot suit with bow tie. Pinstripes in that era were a sign of extroverted male sexuality, the 1940s fashion equivalent of a peacock strutting its display. Men's clothes at the time were very limited in style and variety. You wore a suit and a tie all the time, a hat when you went out. So individuality didn't have a lot of opportunities for expression in fashion, and the conformist culture suppressed most of those. For a man to walk around wearing a suit like this is basically the same thing as walking around in a suit made of flashing neon lights shouting, "Look at me, aren't I sexy?" Film journalist Michael E. Grost notes that the effect of the suit is contradicted by his bow tie. Grost says that the conventional long tie of the era was a phallic symbol, which seems sensible enough, and so any deviance from that suggests emasculation. In Renoir's version of the story, it is clear that the Johnny and Kitty characters do not have a fulfilling sex life together, and that he's incapable of enjoying her body in a normal way. Thanks to Hays Code strictures, this isn't obvious in the Lang version, but it is suggested very strongly that the only physical contact he offers her with any regularity is with his fists. Certainly, Johnny Prince is a man whose outward physical beauty conceals an ugly soul and a cramped, selfish spirit. Grost goes on to note that Johnny's costume appears on two other occasions in Lang cinema. It appeared earlier in Fury, on the man who whipped up the crowd into its state of unreasoning violence, and the same outfit shows up later in Clash by Night, on the character trying to ruin Barbara Stanwyck's marriage. In other words, whether you see the bow tie as a specific symbol of male sexual inadequacy or not, the basic costume of pinstripes and bow tie is a recurring motif for Lang for bad, selfish, destructive men. These costume choices were carefully thought out because Lang went to the bother of hiring the acclaimed costume designer Travis Banton, whose reputation was built on glamour and old Hollywood high style. However, having hired Hollywood's most glamorous designer, Lang appears to have tasked him with creating the least glamorous clothing for his characters. What is clearly more important here is not style for its own sake, but realism and subtle symbolism. By contrast to Eddie Robinson, Dan Duryea was a one-note player. He played this guy, and he played him to great effect and acclaim for many years. Duryea was originally an ad man who swapped Madison Avenue for Sunset Avenue in 1941 in his screen debut in The Little Foxes. His career got an important boost in 1945 when Fritz Lang cast him in The Woman in the Window. Duryea had already worked with Lang once before, playing a Nazi brute on Ministry of Fear, but Woman in the Window was the bigger break for him. In the film, Duryea hauled off and slapped Joan Bennett one in the kisser. Routine sadism for a Lang picture, but with Duryea administering it, the effect was sensational. He actually started to get fan mail from adoring female viewers, believe it or not, according to film noir chronicler Eddie Muller, and this then became Duryea's professional niche. He was a perfectly nice and mild-mannered fella in real life, but he paid the bills and was a fairly big star in his day for punching women in the face on screen. The popularity of film noir during that period meant that Duryea had plenty of opportunities to ply his peculiar trade. A small sample of his film noir output includes Ministry of Fear, Woman in the Window, Lady on a Train, Scarlet Street, Black Angel, Larceny, Crisscross, Manhandled, Too Late for Tears, and Johnny Stoolpigeon. The actor playing the art critic Janeway, the slim blonde guy, is Jess Barker, prominent leading man of Hollywood-produced B-movies. The portly gentleman with him in the role of art dealer Delarue is Arthur Loft, an extremely busy bit player in classic film noir. In fact, if your movie didn't have Arthur Loft in it somewhere, it probably wasn't really film noir. Rounding out the trio in the role of Pop is Russian émigré Vladimir Sokolov, a character actor whose resume is packed with a mix of respectable A-list fare and fun psychotronic B-movie sleaze. He worked with Fritz Lang on two subsequent occasions, Cloak and Dagger and While the City Sleeps. These three men have gathered at Kitty's apartment, or rather, Kitty and Christopher's apartment, to grant the art world's imprimatur on her, or rather, hers and Chris's paintings. Without this process of recognition, the paintings are not even fit to sell in Pop's street booth, but with it, they will soar in value. The kind of art in question here, the kind of art that Chris makes, is called naive art or primitive art, a fairly crude term applied generally to untrained artists whose work is later glommed onto by the professional art world. What Pop and others noted as a lack of perspective in the paintings is either a sign of Cross's lack of skill or a sign of the art's modernity and expressionistic qualities. It all depends on your point of view. The paintings in the film were done by a friend of Lang's named John Decker, who had been advised by the censors at the Hayes office to be careful about what he painted. You know how artists are and what they consider art these days. Decker did a marvelous job with them because they really seem like the kind of canvases a hobbyist might paint. I've seen a lot of movies where for colors some character will be given a hobby like painting or music or pottery, and too often the filmmakers and actors involved just don't get it. And what was supposed to be characterization ends up coming off as a kind of embarrassing and phony trick. Not so here. Chris really genuinely seems to need this hobby, and his paintings look like the kind of thing he actually would paint. Kind of corny. Which leads to the question why his corny, perspective-lacking paintings end up so successful. There are two things I want to say about that. And the first is that I actually have a friend, Matt Cizo, whose career followed much the same trajectory, minus the backstabbing and murder, of course, but he started working out some of his inner demons on canvas without formal training, just for himself. And at first his work was unable to find a happy place in the typical venues where amateur artists sell their work, the kind of street fairs where Johnny is unable to sell Cross's art. But later, they caught the attention of art critics and dealers who did respond to them, and what had once been seen as flaws in his style suddenly became the distinctive selling point, and he took off as a serious, successful, and respected artist in his own right. So the way the film depicts this cycle, where one person's opinion can make all the difference, rings very true to me. And it brings me to the second point I wanted to make. The art critic Janeway, on a whim and based solely on his own taste, singles these paintings out and turns their maker into a star. But the paintings remain what they always were. One day they're worthless junk from a sad old man trying to pass the time, and the next they're valuable collectibles. But how people see them and whether they're willing to pay huge sums for them changes based on just the influence of some guy, and who gave him this kind of power? No one except for maybe Janeway himself seems capable of looking at the paintings and forming a unique personal judgment of their value or quality. What they're worth has little to do with what they are, and more to do with what is said about what they are. It says pretty cynical things about the sheep-like mentality of the average art buyer, and recalls a line from Lang's 1922 film Dr. Mabuse der Spieler, when Mabuse ridiculed the art world's interest in expressionist art as being a form of gambling. It is a form of gambling. The various characters, again, with the lone exception of Janeway, are evaluating the artwork solely in terms of money and what that means to their own bottom line. For Kitty, Johnny, and Delarue as well, the value of the paintings is insofar as they can be sold for lots of money. Adele's uniformly hostile prejudice against the paintings is based on the fact that she, taking for granted there's no way they could ever be sold, sees them solely as useless expenses whereby her husband wastes money on paint and canvas while she has to scrimp and save for something really valuable like a new radio. Only Janeway seems to see the paintings merely as something to be enjoyed, and not as something he personally stands to gain or lose by. Perhaps that's the answer why his art critic's opinion, his one-man pissing into the wind whimsical tastes, carry so much weight compared to everyone else's. His are the untarnished, unconflicted opinions of someone who doesn't have his own livelihood at stake and can afford to express his thoughts honestly. It's not hard to see Lang seeing his own situation reflected in all this, how his pursuit of pure cinematic artistry and self-expression was constantly being impinged upon by the likes of Walter Wanger, who only thought in terms of how much things cost to make, how much they'd bring in sales. In the corporate structure of Diana, Lang must have hoped that Wanger would be his Janeway, only to be disappointed to have Wanger play Delarue instead. During the making of the movie, Lang was fighting a war of memos, one angry letter after another fired off to Walter Wanger regarding what Lang considered Wanger's lackadaisical attitude towards giving Lang proper credit. At the same time that Wanger was vice president of Diana, he was also still a producer for Universal, which was a cozy relationship that actually served Diana well and was beneficial to Lang, but that's not how Lang saw it. He was upset any time there was confusion or perceived confusion about what was Diana's and what was Wanger's at Universal. For example, if visitors to Diana's offices were accidentally directed to Wanger's Universal office, that was sure to set Lang off. Or when Hedda Hopper, the infamous Hollywood gossip columnist, wrote about the upcoming Winchester 73, but attributed it to Wanger at Universal rather than Wanger at Diana. It was an honest mistake born of her sloppy research, but Lang saw it as a conspiracy to deny him proper credit. Meanwhile, he was taking massive meetings with his publicist Margaret Ettinger to find new ways to promote the name Fritz Lang. She mulled over different nicknames: Fritz Lang, Master of the Unusual; Fritz Lang, Master of the Unexpected. These ideas didn't catch on, and even Lang realized they were cleaving too close to Hitchcock's moniker Master of Suspense. But the point is, Lang was obsessed with credit, to a quite unreasonable degree. So it's interesting to view Robinson's character through this lens. How Lang must have sympathized with Criss Cross, how Lang evidently felt, no matter how irrationally, that even within his own company he was losing authorial credit and control. So for Lang it was clearly quite important, this detail of whose name was attached to the paintings. Lang was particularly interested in this aspect of the story, and remembering the film to Bogdanovich, he said, "In my opinion, Robinson's fate in the picture is the fate of an artist who cares more for his paintings than for gaining money." I mentioned earlier that Lang's films occasionally included characters similar to Kitty, and I specifically cited Spies and The Thousand Eyes of Dr. Mabuse. Interestingly, all of these films feature similar scenes of the woman in her shimmering white negligee. There are a number of fun drinking games you can make up around Lang's cinema using common, recurring motifs, and the girl in her nightie is one of them. In the case of Spies, Scarlet Street, and Thousand Eyes of Dr. Mabuse, the nightgown is a hook by which the man is enslaved and ensnared. In Spies, the character named Kitty in that film undresses in front of the Japanese diplomat, and he's doomed to be her pawn. Similarly, Dawn Adams in the Mabuse picture strips down to an almost glowing hot white negligee while being watched by her victim through a one-way mirror. Here, whether she's consciously doing this or not, the process of undressing is a critical step in securing Chris's unhesitating devotion. We're building up to the moment when he will paint his so-called self-portrait of her, the culmination of the fusing of their two identities. When he learns that she's adopted an artificial identity as a sort of female projection of himself, his reaction will be to demand as payment the right to paint her. Here he gets his first chance to paint her, literally to paint on her body. Many critics pointed to his washing dishes as a sign of his emasculation, but this is the real deal. There's no greater humiliation dumped on poor Chris, as she contemptuously mutters they'll be masterpieces. If you had to boil the movie down to its irreducible essence, I bet that iconic scene is what you'd get. As Adele looks in the gallery window at the paintings, we also witness a larger street scene in reflection too, grounding her in the context of a city bustling with activity. A city that didn't exist. This is an indoor set. To accomplish this, Lang had a back projection of a pre-filmed street scene shown on a screen between the camera and the window. The area on the other side of the glass was dimly lit so that the glass acted as a partial mirror, and we got multiple layers of the scene interposed. The paintings within the gallery, and the scenes encoded within those paintings, the observers outside the gallery, and oblivious passers-by whose reflections come between them. This is a fantastic scene of crisscrossed thoughts, as Adele confronts her husband about finding his paintings in Delaroe's window. It never crosses her mind once they might be the same ones that cluttered up her home. That's inconceivable. The junk Chris painted while sitting on the toilet had to be worthless, but it's just as logical to conclude that Delaroe wouldn't put anything in his gallery that wasn't valuable, so she concludes Chris copied Catherine March's work. Of course. She accuses him of crimes, but gets her accusations crisscrossed. She does hit it on the head by wondering if he'll be stealing from his employers next, but otherwise she's managed to misread his transgressions entirely. This is, of course, one of the famed apron scenes. He wears it several times in the movie, but it's important he has it on now, because she is here and now unable to see him as a man, unable to fathom he might be, for example, keeping a mistress. And this is where some Freudian phallic symbolism comes into play. As Tom Gunning points out, the knife is a phallic symbol, and Chris's failure to use it here is consistent with his still emasculated state, emphasized by that frilly floral apron. Chris has displaced sexuality into things like knives because normal sexual relations are denied him. The movie strongly suggests Cross and Kitty did not have a sexual affair. And earlier, there was an exchange between Chris and Adele, when he says he's never seen a naked woman before, and she says, "I should say not." Johnny Prince is the sexual aggressive man Chris is not, and it's worth noting how the phallic knife, which Chris lets drop limply to the ground, dissolves almost perfectly into the shape of Johnny's body. Normally, I'm resistant to pointy-headed interpretations that sound great coming from academics but are inconsistent with the actual thoughts of the filmmakers who aren't usually academics. But both Fritz Lang and Dudley Nichols were well-educated, well-read intellectuals who were very keen on Freud, and so there may be something to this. When he does eventually commit murder, stabbing an ice pick into Kitty's body repeatedly, the sexual connotations of the crime were what aroused the attention of the censors, who felt it urgent to reduce the number of thrusts. Lang's much-loved focus on realism was limited by the puritanical production code and its opposition to dealing frankly with sexual matters. It must have been very frustrating for Lang to be unable to depict sexuality with the same honesty that he could pretty much every other aspect of American life. I know this because he says so in the same story memo I quoted from earlier. After laying out his thoughts on Scarlet Street specifically, Lang waxed philosophical about the larger problems of dealing with sexual issues in American cinema. Quote, "Maybe realism is just knowing the facts of life and using them. You see, the great trouble in Hollywood is, for example, I cannot show a girl having a baby without getting married. The statistics say that out of 10 war marriages, 7 end in divorce. I belong to a school of thought that leads to a lot of damage. Once I should make a prison picture about convicts who talk about women, but how can I make them talk about women in language that is permitted by the Hays Office? They want to have a beautiful woman, a beautiful home. To hell with it. They want something else. They want a girl in pink and blue conversation. They want to have her for very definite reasons. I cannot make a picture of workers who are in a union for different reasons. Now, how can you make realistic pictures?" End quote. This then was the great appeal of Scarlet Street. As Lang described it, quote, "Here in this story, by chance and by purpose, a chance to make certain things as real as possible." The premise of the story allowed Lang to skirt around Hays' office restrictions and come as close as he ever would to touchy issues of sexual infidelity, loveless marriages, sadistic sex, and colossal failures of the judicial system, but stay within prescribed limits. It's no surprise, then, that this film ran afoul of the censors. I would be remiss in my duties as audio commentator if I failed to talk about this extraordinary set, the artist studio that Chris and Kitty share. It's a common feature of Lang's films that his characters are rooted in specific locations, not just the establishing of a realistic milieu, as I mentioned in the opening montage of this film, but more precisely, how characters become associated with certain sets. This particular set was designed by the great production designer Alexander Golitsyn. He rose to legendary status at Universal Studios and was often working with Walter Wanger, both for studios and for Wanger's various independent outings. Golitsyn earned a staggering 14 Oscar nominations in his time and took the statue home 3 times. Remember in Alfred Hitchcock's Foreign Correspondent the scene where the plane plunges into the sea and the ocean rushes through the cockpit? That was Golitsyn, working with William Cameron Menzies, and it earned him one of his Academy Award nominations. But it wasn't until he handled the Technicolor version of Phantom of the Opera in 1943 that he finally won. Fritz Lang, who took production design very seriously, chose well in selecting Golitsyn for the job. I've had so many other anecdotes and topics to cover for you, I haven't had a chance to talk yet about Lang's characteristic approach to editing. The nominal editor of the film was Mr. Arthur Hilton, but he was working under Lang's direction and became one of Lang's good buddies, so it is fine to accept his work as an expression of Lang's vision, and Lang had very definite ideas about editing. Lang worked off a variation of Eisenstein's dialectic. Now, don't get thrown by the film scholar jargon. As with diegetic music, these are just highfalutin words. The thing to remember is that in Fritz Lang movies, meaning is derived not just from the specific content of individual scenes, but by the juxtaposition connecting them. So scene A and scene B may tell you, the viewer, certain things about the plot, but scene A followed by scene B may give you some additional or even contradictory information. Let's take a specific example. Catherine March is displaying what she purports to be her self-portrait. In so doing, she is objectified. She's flattened out, even more than just the flatness of the canvas, because his rendition of her is so flat, lacking depth and perspective. She's reduced to an object, something under someone else's control. This then transitions through a dissolve to Chris in his cubicle. He, too, is an object behind glass, something on display. Now, we've talked about how together, Kitty and Chris are manufacturing a composite identity, which means in turn that each one of them is only part of the whole. Whatever happens to one of them must be reflected by a parallel occurrence to the other. The transition is important then because if you put this scene somewhere else in the movie or interposed something between the shot of the portrait and of him behind his glass screen, the full effect would be diluted. The scene of him at work has a specific function in the movie beyond the superficial aspects of plot advancement contained in the actual content of the shots. What Lang wants us to keep in the back of our minds is that Chris is not just the victim of Kitty and Johnny's exploitation. The things happening at Delarose's gallery and in Kitty's blossoming, phony career as a famous artist are also the end result of his own desires and designs. And so what ultimately rebounds back to Chris is a consequence of his own actions. He's put a line around his feelings for Kitty and turned her into an object to frame in a gallery, but he can't pretend to be outside or above this process because Kitty is in a way a facet of his own self. His greatest mistake is in assuming that he's the puppet master. He chuckles at seeing his painting in the paper and enjoys watching his girl's star rise because he believes he's in control of it. And it is at this point that we meet Homer Higgins. Up until this point, he had been held out as a paragon of virtue, the one example the film had of someone who didn't act out of selfishness, a hero. But Lang's irrepressible cynicism takes hold, and we see this man as a liar, a cheat, and a hood. He has a trail of minor crimes behind him and plans on some blackmailing ahead of him. Even the eye patch he wears is phony. Chris has a clever plan to expose Homer and thereby escape his own dead-end marriage and be free to pursue Kitty. But the thing is, it's like the old saying that people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. People wearing masks shouldn't go around exposing other people's masks. Noir played this plot twist for laughs, and he ended the scene with Adele confronting her no longer dead hubby with full-on sitcom-style chaos, I Love Lucy style. Lang steers clear of the comedy because he recognizes the tragedy it masks. Chris thinks he's so clever pulling this trick on Homer and Adele, but it will lead him directly into disaster. The sad truth of Chris's half-life is he was better off as a loser. Back when he was a miserable clock puncher, at least he could live his dreams in private in the bathroom. Once he started taking action, he started ruining his own life. Every step he's taken to take control of his destiny has only made things worse. Many sources make mention of the fact that Scarlet Street was alone among Lang's American films to encounter serious censorship troubles. This is true to an extent, but in the telling some confusion has crept in. For one thing, it would be a mistake to assume that Lang, dealing as he did in stories of corruption, violence, and hatred, was not fairly constantly arguing with censors over where to draw the line. For another, while many summaries of Lang's career may casually say that Scarlet Street fell afoul of the Hays Code, when Peter Bogdanovich asked Lang about this, Lang flatly and unequivocally said no, the Hays office had no complaint against Scarlet Street. Somewhere along the way, something's gotten tangled up here, so let's see about untangling it. First, some history. During the latter part of the silent era, a handful of scandals about shocking behavior in Hollywood resulted in a widespread feeling that Hollywood was out of touch with American values and dangerous to our God-fearing society's morals. The business leaders who ran the studios feared that this public outcry would result in some kind of federal regulation of the movie industry, not just governmental censorship, but perhaps more widespread economic regulation with it. So to stave off this fearsome prospect, the studios decided to self-regulate with their own censorship institution. The production code was written up and established in 1930, and at first it wasn't seriously enforced. But by 1934, however, the year that Fritz Lang arrived in Hollywood, professional motion pictures made in the United States had to adhere to the code. Because the code was administered by a guy named Hays, the production code was also known by the nickname the Hays Code or the Hays Office. And by 1945, when Scarlet Street was made, the head of the office was Joseph Breen. So it was sometimes also called the Breen Office, and the whole shebang eventually morphed into the MPAA ratings administration that we have today. How it worked back then was like this. You're a movie producer, you have a copy of the code, which carefully lists what you should not include in your movie. For example, no nudity, don't make adultery seem appealing, don't show murderers getting away with their crimes or make their actions seem justified, don't ridicule or call into question the integrity of the judicial system. Okay, so you can take these sort of things into account as you have your script written. And even so, once you've got your script all written, you submit it to the Hays office. There'll be some back and forthing with the censors to make sure objectionable material is omitted or adjusted before you start shooting. And again, once the film is completed, there'll be some more back and forthing with the censors and the editors for last-minute fixes and cuts. Then you get the seal of approval, without which you could not distribute your film. Now, the important thing to remember about all of this with respect to Scarlet Street is that while adhering to the production code may have been a contractual obligation on the part of producers and directors in their employment agreements with the studios, the whole process was a voluntary one created by the studios to guard against federal censorship. The whole point of the thing wasn't to avoid breaking some law, because there wasn't a law. It was to steer filmmakers away from the controversial subjects or images that had the greatest likelihood of enraging viewers who would get all upset and start picketing or writing to their congresspeople. In other words, just because you got Hays office approval for your film didn't mean you were protected from further controversy or censorship from some other entity. It's a bit like traffic laws, the overall purpose of which is to reduce the opportunities for collisions. You can get away with speeding and running red lights all you want. It doesn't do you any good if you end up in an accident because of it, which is what happened to Lang, as we shall see. Now, Scarlet Street managed to scrape up against pretty much every single item on the production code's don't do list, but the one point that was potentially the deal breaker was that Criss Cross commits a variety of crimes, including murder, without ever being formally punished. Of course, as anyone involved in the production was happy to point out, that doesn't mean the film lets Criss off scot-free. Maybe the police don't get him, but he pays for his transgressions nevertheless. He loses his family, his job, his painting, and the ability to sell them, everything he cares for in the world, and is doomed to walk the city a derelict, tortured by guilt, and unable to function in society anymore. The protagonist in La Chienne meets a similar fate, but the shading's entirely different. In Renoir's film, he's content with his degraded life and reasonably satisfied to live as a bum, an anarchist rejecting society. Lang had no interest in such a finale, and shows Criss a destroyed, ravaged wreck of a man. Lang had a long heart-to-heart with Joseph Breen, a fellow Catholic, and appealed to his Catholic sense of guilt. Criss's conscience is a harsher court to face than any secular one, and with that, the film was cleared, but the real censorship battle began. Enter the Catholic Legion of Decency. They found the film unsavory, kinky, licentious, and troubling, and passed it with a B rating, objectionable in part. This was a workable rating, not a ban, but it was a signal that emboldened the other decency mongers across the country. The New York State Board of Censors banned it outright, which was an extremely rare action for them to take, and this was then followed by Atlanta and Milwaukee concurring. Now, it's one thing to haggle with censors during a screenwriting stage and find agreeable alternatives and compromises, but quite another to have your finished product, the culmination of your company's investment, barred from 3 major markets. The movie'd been shot, so the only options now were to try to recoup your investment without screening the movie in New York. That's not much of an option. Or trying to persuade the censors to reverse their decision. Again, a tricky option because they'd banned it outright. Or to make cuts that would appease the censors, which is the sort of thing Lang would just never agree to. But Lang didn't get into the fight at all. He was off working on Cloak and Dagger for United States Pictures and didn't have time to spare. This was going to have to be Walter Wanger's fight. Dudley Nichols offered Wanger some moral support. He wrote, quote, "Films have remained adolescent for so long because Hollywood has not fought for freedom of the screen as publishers have fought. You don't have to have freedom of the screen to make profits, which is why suppression is so dangerous, but you have to have freedom and moral responsibility if you're to have self-respect and respect for the screen among all intelligent men everywhere." Nichols was determined to vigorously fight the censors without compromise. But just to complicate Wanger's position, he added an unhelpful coda. He was personally surprised to see that stuff that he'd felt was problematic and should have been cut from the script had ended up in the final cut. During the screenwriting process, Nichols knew they were, as he put it, walking a tight wire between the social mores at the time and what they felt was right for the story. Certain lines of dialogue or scenes that he worried might have crossed that line, and which he'd intended to cut, somehow sailed all the way through. Nichols was vague whether this was the result of sloppy secretaries hastily cobbling old drafts in with later ones, or whether Lang had impishly reinstated cut material on his own. Either way, you can easily imagine the smoldering anger inside Wanger. The remaking of La Chienne had been Lang's idea. He hired and worked with Nichols to craft the screenplay. Lang made the film on his own, as his own boss. If the film had problems, they were of Lang's making, and now he couldn't even stand up for his own creation because he was off working for the competition? Wanger had helped create this company, had come up with Lang's financing to make it happen. He'd surrendered his own control within the company so that Lang could be the majority shareholder in a venture whose primary selling point was the distinctiveness of Lang's vision. For Lang to work for another company meant that Lang's films weren't an exclusive offering of Diana, diluting Diana's value. To say nothing of the personal abuse that Lang heaped on Wanger at every turn. But good soldier that he was, Wanger fought for Scarlet Street valiantly. He mobilized massive support across Hollywood and within political circles, and flew to New York to meet directly with Dr. Irwin Conroe, head of the censor board. Wanger brought along editor Arthur Hilton so that as they negotiated possible cuts, Hilton could advise immediately which ones hurt the continuity of the film and when he had alternate takes of scenes that might be used to resolve the censor's complaints. And with Wanger's diplomatic resolve, they came to a deal. The movie, which you'll recall New York had decreed completely unacceptable in its entirety, was now cleared for release with but 2 minor cuts. The cuts were these. In the scene in which Kitty shows her new apartment to Johnny, he asks where the bedroom is, and as you may have noticed, that line is still in this print. The other cut came from this, Kitty's death scene, where Edward G. Robinson originally was seen to stab that ice pick into her 7 times. Now, according to the documents, a single stab would suffice. In this version, indeed, with every print of Scarlet Street I've ever seen, he stabs her 4 times. So I suspect the alleged 7 stabbings of the original cut was a miscount, or maybe an exaggeration. Or perhaps at some point Wanger and Hilton went back and revised the master negative to be a little more discreet. In any event, the cuts demanded for the New York market were made only on locally distributed prints, and the version you see here is untouched. If you find the notion of counting stab wounds silly, you're in good company. Lang rolled his eyes at all this and joked, "Is it immoral to stab a woman 4 times, but moral to stab her only once?" Apparently so, because Dr. Conroe not only recanted his ban, but even issued a formal statement essentially apologizing for misunderstanding the sincere artistry of Fritz Lang and praising the cut version of Scarlet Street as a fine, upstanding moral film suitable for distribution. In other words, Walter Wanger rocks. Settling the matter in Atlanta proved a little harder and involved a lawsuit, but in the end he prevailed, and he even persuaded Universal Studios to pick up the legal tab. Not only that, but along the way, Wanger made sure to keep the press appraised of his noble struggle against small-minded censorship, and the free publicity added up handsomely. Scarlet Street was a significant commercial hit. It recouped its production costs in just 6 months and doubled Diana's stock value in a year. There is another aspect of Scarlet Street's censorship battle I didn't mention. I didn't mention it because no one else did either. Not the various censors so worked up about Johnny's interest in Kitty's bedroom, or the number of times an ice pick was inserted into her body. Not the filmmakers discussing the nature of Chris's guilty conscience. Not the journalists covering the battle, or the reviewers and critics debating the film's merits. Fritz Lang noticed it, though, and with a wry sense of humor pointed out to interviewer Gene D. Phillips, quote, "Interestingly enough, not one review complained that an innocent man had to go to the chair for a crime he did not commit. But the reason that no one commented on it is possibly not because they were aware that he had done a lot of other things that would have justified his death, but because they simply did not like his character. If this is so, one wonders if the morals of the average moviegoer have eroded over the years." End quote. Now, this is a very interesting point, and it deserves some closer analysis. One of the primary story structures for film noir as a genre is the wrong man scenario. Hitchcock made a movie by that very title, which is a fine template for the scenario, but if you want to stick to Lang, I could point to Blue Gardenia as a very typical, even generic rendition of the wrong man story. Go to the film noir section of your local video store and grab a movie at random, and you've got good odds on having picked up a wrong man plot. The basic idea is some poor sap who looks for all the world like they did a crime, usually murder, and the film is about trying to somehow find the proof that they didn't do it. Now, in some renditions of the story, it goes so far that the character is actually convicted on the basis of this incomplete or misunderstood evidence and sentenced to death, only to be saved at the 11th hour. For example, Call Northside 777, or from a different perspective, 12 Angry Men. Again, if we want to limit ourselves to Lang's movies, Beyond a Reasonable Doubt would be the one to see. Now, I have to apologize for the spoiler, but I have to spoil it in order to make my point. In Beyond a Reasonable Doubt, it ultimately turns out Dana Andrews isn't a wrong man. He actually did do the murder, and he's been correctly sentenced to death. That final scene in Beyond a Reasonable Doubt, the final scene that Lang made for American movies, was a point of contention so intense, he severed his ties with Hollywood completely in response to that fight and left this country to go make his final films in post-war Germany. At issue in that fight was the execution of Dana Andrews. The producer wanted to conclude the movie with Andrews' electrocution, and Lang vigorously opposed it. Lang had made the film with the explicit intent of discrediting capital punishment. Like anyone who made film noir, he was keenly aware of how innocent people could be falsely accused or even convicted. But his personal politics were even more intense than most. He hated the death penalty and wanted to use his position in the media to help advocate against it. He felt that to end the movie with the execution was to invalidate all the arguments made against the death penalty during the course of the rest of the film. He lost that fight, gave up, and left town. Now, way back in the olden days, when he made M, Lang had conceived of that film as an anti-death penalty argument. Here it was, a movie about the most awful crime imaginable, a man who rapes and murders children, but his crimes rend the city apart and bring society itself to the brink of collapse. A mob captures the culprit, and we, the audience, know they've got the right guy. No wrong man scenario at work here. And in the final moments of the movie, this despicable wretch actually becomes humanized and speaks sympathetically in his own defense. In Lang's mind, the point was obvious. Even the worst among us are still human. But the Nazis in charge of the country saw it the other way and praised the film for what they saw as its defense of capital punishment. Lang left Nazi Germany, and his first film in America was Fury, which dealt with similar themes. In that film, Lang was determined not to be misunderstood again, and he cannily crafted a bifurcated plot that worked both sides of the issue. In the first part, Spencer Tracy is a man mistaken for a kidnapper and lynched by a mindless mob. In part 2, we learn he did not actually die, but emerged from the experience determined to see every one of his attackers executed for their part in the lynching. So across the film, we see first the wrong man story and how easily innocent people can be punished for another's crimes. And that is then followed by a study in how immoral and ugly it is to try to use the judicial system to exact revenge. In the final scene of Fury, and again, I'm sorry for the spoiler, Spencer Tracy pulls back and allows his tormentors off the hook so no one is wrongly executed. In fact, the text of the production code read in part, "The courts of the land should not be presented as unjust. This does not mean that a single court may not be presented as unjust, much less that a single court official must not be presented this way. But the court system of the country must not suffer as a result of this presentation." There is some fudge room there, but not much. And the prevailing attitude in Hollywood in 1945 was that you simply did not show a wrongful execution. Even today, 60 years on, it's a subject of profound debate. Liberals and opponents of capital punishment take for granted that the errors in the system have at times allowed people to be executed for crimes they did not commit. Equally certain are proponents of capital punishment that the various safeguards catch such mistakes. Both sides continue to think that a firmly proven, unambiguous case of a wrongful execution would be a major transformation in the nature of the debate. So it's simply jaw-droppingly amazing that Lang got away with this, placing square in the heart of Scarlet Street a scene in which a man is put to death for a specific crime of which he is certainly innocent. As Lang notes, the fact that Johnny is in no way a sympathetic character certainly smooths this potential controversy over. And as Lottie Eisner observed, the fact that we know Johnny to be guilty of other crimes means that some viewers reconcile the discrepancy by saying, okay, he didn't kill Kitty, but he deserved to fry for other reasons. The thing of it is, that's not how the system's supposed to work. You're on trial for a specific offense, and your punishment or freedom hinges on that one charge. I think the real reason Lang got away with this audacious challenge to the authority of the American court system is that he surrounded it with so many distractions the censors missed it. There was a notorious deleted scene that would have appeared right around here. We see Chris on the train to the death house. Well, what's he going there for? In the original cut of the movie, he secrets himself outside the prison and scales a telephone pole alongside the window, looking in on the electric chair. As the hour approaches, Eddie Robinson gets increasingly agitated. According to the actual wording of Dudley Nichols' script, Chris starts shaking his fists and chanting, "Now, now, now," as if he were praying to the god of electricity. A guard shoos him down from the pole, but Chris is triumphant, delighted beyond all measure that he has seen Johnny killed. When Lang's original cut was submitted to Universal's publicity department, Mervyn Hauser, head of publicity for the studio, screened the film with his staff, and they generally liked it, but were concerned that at 1 hour 45 minutes it was a dangerously long length. Lang was still obsessed with the notion that a film's running time equaled its prestige, but the guys charged with selling it to exhibitors knew that shorter running times were better when possible. However, while Lang bitterly resented Universal's cuts, there was one he accepted, the telephone pole gag. Lang later told Bogdanovich that he felt the scene was silly and added an inappropriate comic touch. Oddly enough, that was the exact same opinion as Universal's publicity staff. It's so profoundly out of character for Lang to agree with anyone about anything. Much rarer still for him to think the clods at Universal might actually have a good point. I suspect Lang left the scene in as a decoy so that people looking for something to remove from his movie could do so without fully cottoning on to what an amazing thing it is that Dan Derrier gets the chair for a murder he didn't do. Universal's publicity staff cut 2 other scenes as well. One was a scene where Robinson reads Romeo and Juliet to Joan Bennett while still under the illusion she's an actress. Stills from this ended up in the press kit. It was no great loss. A second cut occurred at the end of the scene, which Chris has betrayed and revealed to Dell's husband. The film, as it stands now, sees Chris creeping out and leaves the rest to the viewer's imagination. The original cut continued as the police caught Chris sneaking out, and there were some sitcom-style confusions about who was really Adele's husband. This is how Renoir plays the scene, and Lang copied it in his version, but it was unnecessary, too comic for the increasingly grim tone of Lang's film, and something had to be cut to shorten the film. In the various discussions about the morality of Scarlet Street, it's largely taken for granted that Criss Cross is haunted by guilt at the end. Lang talks endlessly about this in every interview. There are so many fine examples in Lang's films of characters haunted by guilt, it's easy to fit this in with the established pattern. Think of the end of Dr. Mabuse der Spieler, as Mabuse is confronted in his mind's eye by the ghosts of his victims, pointing an accusation at him, reducing the once great Ubermensch to a babbling idiot. I accepted this reading of the ending myself unquestioningly, until I read Lottie Eisner's analysis of the movie and realized I'd overlooked a stunningly obvious feature. Alone among the scholars who've written about Lang, she knew him best, and when she looked at Scarlet Street, she saw something everybody else missed. Chris isn't exactly haunted by guilt. His ultimate degradation and dereliction is not entirely due to having gotten away with 2 murders. The thing he can't escape is that even after those 2 murders, he wasn't able to kill off the humiliation Kitty and Johnny forced upon him. Everything Chris did to create the trappings of a relationship, of a faux marriage, was to bolster his fantasy that a younger woman loved him, and that he was a successful painter. His line in the opening scene was, "I wonder what it's like to be loved by a young girl like that." Not, "I wonder what it's like to love a girl like that." It's not enough to keep her as he does. His ultimate fantasy will only be fulfilled when she loves him. That's what he so desperately needs. His discovery that she's been using him callously, that she genuinely loves Johnny, the brutal, childish thug, that she prefers Johnny and his cruel violence to any tenderness Chris has to offer, that she prefers Johnny's empty exploitation of others to Chris's actual marketable talent. These are wounds more intense than any Adele was capable of inflicting. "Jeepers, I love you, Johnny." That's what haunts him most. This line of Kitty's is the ghost inside his head that drives him to ruin, and as a voice of one's conscience, it seems singularly fixated not on the crime itself, but on Chris's motive for that crime. Chris's failed suicide is another recurring Langian motif familiar to his longtime fans. Edward G. Robinson attempted suicide in the previous film, Woman in the Window, as well. That one failed only because it turned out the experience was a dream, and he woke up from it safe and sound. But the suicide here is foiled by the intercession of others. Throughout Lang's movies, one is confronted with real suicides, murders disguised as suicides, suicides mistaken for murders, and failed and foiled attempts to kill oneself. Criss Cross survives here because, of course, living with his demons is the far greater punishment. His hell is hell on earth. But there are actually 3 failed suicides in this movie. In addition to Chris's botched one here, heroic Patch-Eye Homer intervened in a woman's suicide jump to save her, but then faked his own death to make it look like he died in the process. 2 phony self-murders for the price of 1.
Jeepers, I love you, Johnny.
On the similarity between La Chienne and Scarlet Street, Lang said not a single scene was copied. That is simultaneously true and false. The plot is essentially identical, following the exact same sequence of events from start to finish. Some shots are even staged in the same manner, using the same visualization. However, the tone and effect of the two pictures differ markedly. Lang is fully justified in distinguishing his rendition. And if he wanted to assert that his version was wildly superior, I'd go along with him on that count too. This final sequence is a case in point. I've already mentioned that Renoir concludes his movie with the character, called Maurice Legrand, a bum, but that in the French version he is content with his lot, the kind of person who in the 1960s might have been considered a dropout. Conversely, Criss Cross is a tortured wraith. Both Criss Cross and Maurice Legrand ultimately walk past the art gallery as a painting of their own is sold and taken away. In Renoir's version, there is a comical irony as Maurice is blithely unaware that his painting, an actual self-portrait attributed to his mistress, is sold for a fortune, and instead he's happy to have found some money in the street and misses the drama behind him. Lang forces Criss to confront his painting. In this case, the canvas is called a self-portrait, but is actually his painting of his mistress, and when it is sold for a fortune, the old man must consider how much he's lost, all wrapped up in one potent symbol. The canvas stares back at him. The face of the woman he killed, the face of the woman who stole his identity, an artifact reminding him that he can no longer paint and will never receive the money his art is earning. He can kill her, but the painting lives on, and with it her memory. Not just his memory of her and of the truth, but of this lie that he helped invent that now lives on as a legend, eclipsing his own identity. And so Fritz Lang concludes his film with a devastating moment. An emotional apocalypse, as this man is forced to realize that he briefly had everything he'd ever wanted and destroyed it all. I don't think Lang had the requisite distance on his own life to realize that he was in the very same process himself, was about to dash his own hopes and dreams in the same act of self-destruction, but it is fascinating as a film historian to be able to look back and see that connection. I am privileged to have had the honor of joining you for this presentation of Scarlet Street, and I hope that if this is your first foray into the dark world of Fritz Lang, that it isn't your last. This is David Kalat, signing off.